Well, thank you. And thank you everyone for joining us today for negotiating partnerships between communities and the offshore wind industry. My name is Jen McCann, and I'm with the University of Rhode Island Coastal Resources Center and Rhode Island Sea Grant. And today we're again talking about negotiating partnerships between communities and the offshore wind industry. We have brought together a group of individuals who have both researched this topic and have engaged in this experience. So some good academics, as well as people, real practitioners, and as well as amazing stakeholders who have really resource users, community members who have engaged in this process. So lots of good experience here. There's also many of you on this call who've been part of these negotiations and interactions, and we'd love to hear from your experience as well, and both providing your expertise, but also questions that you may have on this topic. Not sure if you've noticed, but today we're trying a different approach. We've asked several of the panelists to pre-record their presentations, their PowerPoint presentations, and I will put the link in the chat room, or maybe Amy, you could do that, or we can provide you with that. So some of you have listened to these pre-recordings, but you're welcome to go back and listen to them so that during this 90 minutes, we have more time for discussion and interaction. So we're trying this out. And so you will, you can go visit those pre-recordings, obviously after our event. We have my co-host here, David Bidwell. It will be also helping to facilitate this process, which is great. So David is with the URI as well, the Department of Marine Affairs. So what we're going to do is David will be summarizing these presentations in the beginning using more of an interview approach with some of the individuals who are on the panel. We have Claire Haggett, who is the senior lecturer at the University of Edinburgh in Scotland, and also Suzanne McDonald, who is the Chief Community Development Officer from the Island Institute in Maine. We also have David Rudolph, who's the researcher from the Department of Wind Energy Society, Market and Policy, Technical University of Denmark. So some really great presenters, and again, their recordings are online. We also have 3 additional panelists who have quite a bit of experience with negotiations between municipalities and the offshore renewable energy industry. We have Richard Andre, who is the president at Vineyard Power, West Tisbury, Massachusetts. We have Tara Heyer, a community benefits from the Community Benefits Advisory Committee for Monhegan Island in Maine. And then we have our very own Kim Gaffett, who from Black Island, and she was first warden and our Rhode Island Ocean Special Air Management Plan representative during the process of siting the Black Island Wind Farm and implementation. So at first, we're going to we encourage you guys to sort of put your mute button on at this point. David is going to facilitate the conversation. And then around 9:40, we'll be bringing your questions to the discussion. So for the moment, we'd like you to just mute yourself and listen. You're welcome to, again, put your questions in the chat room, or you can also raise your hand and we can call on you, but we're going to be doing that part around 9:40. So again, we'd encourage you to just stay muted for the moment. Just some points. We are also recording this. So if you want to share this with someone, you can, we will send you that recording later on. just one point about how we're defining communities, and I'm sure David is going to bring this up as well. This is a huge issue, and we can define communities in different ways. Today, we are going to define communities as the municipalities. Okay, so and again, we can talk about other communities, but for this 90 minutes, we'd like to discuss municipalities as our communities. So with that, I am going to pass it over to David, and who's going to set the stage. Thanks, David.
Yeah, and I would add, Jen, there may be some discussion around the sort of community question and how it comes around, because it certainly comes out in some of the video presentations as well. I want to say just another extra good morning to everyone. As Jen said, my name is David. I'm on the faculty of the Department of Marine Affairs at the University of Rhode Island. If you don't know what that means, that's perfectly fine. We usually get a confused look when we say we're from Marine Affairs. We're a small sort of multidisciplinary department that deals with all kinds of management and policy issues around coastal and marine systems. And one area that we've been really interested in over the past 6, 7, 10 years or so, and even beyond that, is this idea of using the ocean space for the generation of electricity. And one of the reasons that it's been of particular interest to us is, of course, that the first commercial offshore wind farm in the US was the Block Island Wind Farm, which is developed just 3 miles off the coast of one of the islands that is part of Rhode Island. And that has really served as a very good laboratory for us in trying to understand issues around policy and social impacts of offshore wind. And it's been a great experience to do that. It has raised our interest in all kinds of topics that look even beyond Block Island to offshore wind energy development around the world and across the US. Many of you are probably aware that there are quite a few federal leases up and down the US coast, particularly along the East Coast. I think they have 16 leases now. And over the last couple of years, there has been a flurry of activity within the states as they create markets for these offshore wind projects. And now there are numerous and hundreds of megawatts of potential energy in development within projects within those states. In terms of our topic today of community benefits, my interest in this topic was really raised by one of our students. A couple of years ago, a graduate student in marine affairs named Grant Tyler came to me, and he had an interest in this topic. And Grant was he grew up in Kitty Hawk, North Carolina. So some of you who are familiar with the US offshore wind development landscape or seascape know that one of the lease areas is actually called the Kitty Hawk lease. And so for his thesis, he looked at community members' preferences for the possibility of community benefits in the Outer Banks of North Carolina. And one of the things that makes that community or these communities really of interest is that they are the communities that are closest to the proposed wind farm, and yet they are unlikely to see many of the direct benefits in terms of economic development, jobs, etc., because many of those will be done in areas that have deep ports where they can move equipment back and forth, but that's not the case in these coastal communities. And so he was really interested in what are the ways that this proposed project at Kitty Hawk could raise some benefits for the community in which he grew up. And the same thing as we look around at what's happening in the US, we've seen examples where there have been benefits that have been created or are being discussed for some of these projects. Things like a high-speed internet cable that was included in the transmission cable to the Block Island project. We know that there's been a partnership between a community organization in the island of Martha's Vineyard Power, with the Vineyard Wind project, which is currently under development. We've seen some host community agreements around transmission landings that, of course, if you're going to build a wind farm offshore, the transmission cable has to come ashore somewhere. And there have been quite a bit of negotiation among those communities that might host the cable and potential developers. And then we've seen some much broader kinds of benefits being discussed as well, mostly at the state level, around issues of ports redevelopment, investments by developers in sort of refurbishing ports where they might work on some of the development, or jobs training programs at the state or different community levels. So we've been seeing some of the examples that are here, but what we found is also we can learn a great deal from what has happened in Europe. Since Europe is, a couple decades ahead of us in terms of offshore wind development, we can look to them to try to understand some of the things that have happened in the past. I'm super excited today to see people like David Rudolph and Claire Haggett on the call, whose work I've admired for a long time. And I know that a few years ago, they were involved together in a project trying to understand how this notion of community benefits, which has been tried a lot in onshore renewables development, could be and has been applied in the offshore context. So it's very nice to see them on board and to have been able to watch the videos that they presented. The same with Suzanne McDonald from the Island Institute. In terms of being here at in the United States, they did a terrific report a couple of years ago and produced some articles out of that, looking at some of the projects that have been in development or have been proposed in some island communities here in the New England region, and some of the things that have happened there, including issues around benefits. So I'm very happy to be able to engage in a conversation with them and some of the stakeholders, community members who we also have on the call today. So I've had the ability to look at the videos that were produced by David and Claire and Suzanne, and been able to see some of the themes that are there. So I'm just going to talk about those for a few minutes. I may check in with those panelists to make sure that I've got things right, or if they have a couple of comments. And then we'll turn for some discussion among the panelists as well. One of the difficult points, and I know David Rudolph addressed this in his video, is just how you go about defining what community benefits means to begin with, okay? But in general, and David can correct me if I've got this wrong, community benefits really refers to a variety of mechanisms in which developers of a project, an offshore wind project in this case, are providing some form of payment or investment to a community that is traditionally onshore, right? And that community can be defined in many ways. So it's a very broad kind of definition in terms of what is considered community benefits. Do I have that right, David?
Yes, yeah. First of all, good afternoon from Denmark here. It's already afternoon, and yes, you are absolutely right. This is the initial understanding of community benefits that we had. Also, it was shaped by the understanding of the Scottish government back then, that a benefit is something that needs to be provided in addition to something. But so this could be really like most of the time a payment to a local area, which is variously defined. But when we dug a little bit deeper there, we also found out that actually the developers have a different understanding there, and as well that they also consider more indirect benefits, like, as you mentioned, the refurbishment of harbors or the enhancement of local infrastructure, and as well those things are also considered as a benefit as such.
Yeah, so part of what we might do today is really think about, how do we even define what community benefits are or should be? I really also, I liked the video by Suzanne McDonald in which she, talks about some of the reasons why developers might provide these sorts of benefits that are in addition to some of the things that they are providing in terms of jobs or clean power. And in the Island Institute report, they really found that providing of benefits was one of the key aspects of balancing these private and public benefits. If you think of, there's a lot of investment, a lot of profits made from offshore wind, and that this is a way of sort of providing some balance. And I think in Claire Haggett's video, she talked about different forms of justice and equity, and that community benefits are one way of sort of balancing out and evening that out. And one of the other benefits also can be this establishment of trust and a sense of fairness between the developer and the community. And really, both the developer and the community can find that beneficial. I did want to make a note, and this was something that that David Rudolph mentioned, is that there's a real difference between compensation and community benefits. So I know that in New England, there's been a lot of talk about compensation for estimated losses in certain fields. And that's really not what we're talking about. We're not talking about the sort of legal contracts for compensation for economic losses, but we're talking about something different that goes beyond that in terms of providing benefits that are there. One of the things that I really took away from these the videos is just the diversity of ways that we can define community. For instance, sometimes we can define community in terms of proximity to the project. What's the community that is, or the municipalities that are closest to a specific project? Sometimes we can talk about affected municipalities. So municipalities who might be bearing the impact of visual impacts or potential tourism impacts, both positive and negative. But we can also define communities very narrowly in terms of what are sometimes called host communities. If you think about like where a cable comes ashore, that there are really many, many different ways of thinking about community. And I know that that's really where Claire Haggett's part of her presentation focused. Do you want to say a word or two about that, Claire? At this point, you'll have more opportunities, but I don't know if you want to chime in.
Sure, I'd be delighted. Thanks very much, David. And hello and warm greetings to you all from a surprisingly warm Edinburgh afternoon. It's great to be with you all. Thank you very much for what you've said so far, David. That's been a perfect summary of the work that David Rudolph and I have been doing. And you're absolutely right about the diversity of different schemes and the diversity of different ways of defining communities. And very often, actually, that's a good thing, because it means that those particular schemes are more likely to be appropriate for those particular communities. And what we've discovered through our research, and I'm sure what most of you know, is that when we're thinking about the development of renewable energy, wind farms on and offshore, we know that one size doesn't fit all in terms of thinking about impacts, in terms of thinking about who the relevant community might be, in terms of thinking about which benefits might be most appropriate. So that diversity is usually a good thing because it reflects the diversity of the communities in which these projects are based.
Thank you for those comments, Claire. You know, one of the things that I think is really valuable from Claire and David's work is this understanding of relationships among the perceptions of impacts, how we define communities, and the understanding of benefit. So, for example, if you start with a really narrow definition of what the community is in terms of, say, a municipality that's hosting a transmission cable, that's going to create a really specific understanding of what the impacts are, right? Which may be around that onshore infrastructure or the construction of that onshore infrastructure. So you're really thinking about a narrow term of impacts. Or if you are, as David said, you know, a developer who thinks of benefits in terms of indirect benefits of providing renewable energy and economic development or things like jobs training, that might assume a very, very broad definition of community to think about an entire state or counties or what have you. So it's a really interesting way of thinking about that tie-in and how those different things relate to each other. And I'm going to bet that as we open the floor up today and talk more about what some of the communities experience, you're going to see those various assumptions about the impacts that are important, how the community is defined, and what that means in terms of benefits. I just, in starting out, I also want to just acknowledge a couple other things that I saw as themes that ran through some of the talks. One is that impacts certainly can include both offshore, which I think we tend to think about a lot in terms of, say, visual impacts or impacts on offshore resources, but a growing understanding, I think, within the US that it also means onshore infrastructure where those cables come ashore. And that's very often been a focus of benefits conversations. But I also saw a theme that ran through all of the presentations as well. And I don't know if Suzanne wants to say a words about this, which is about the importance of the process used to make these decisions. And all three of our videos talked about the importance of participatory processes in engaging communities in making decisions as well. Suzanne, do you want to say a couple words about that in what you found in the research that the Island Institute took on?
Sure. Thanks, David. Good morning, good afternoon, everyone. I'm Suzanne McDonald, coming to you from Rockland, Maine, Mid-Coast Maine here. Yeah, I mean, I think part of this is, you know, the coast of Maine is a relatively small place. Island communities are generally small places. Things operate off of relationships. And a lot of this to me is just about being good neighbors. I think in our region here in New England, we're somewhat unique in that the beginnings of this industry with offshore wind are very much in very close proximity to these communities. So while those of us on the mainland can say, oh, that's 10, 12, 20 miles offshore, it's actually really only a couple of miles offshore from these smaller island communities. So a lot of this is just, how do we get along? How do we coexist? How do we communicate? And so a lot of that comes back to that participatory process that we talk about in our work. And really, you know, trying to get at the heart, I think what's so interesting in all of this is that I think many of us see offshore wind as a great opportunity at a time where, you know, the burning of fossil fuels is bringing great impacts to our island communities, to the ocean. The Gulf of Maine is one of the most rapidly changing parts of the ocean in the world. And there are generally high levels of support for technologies like offshore wind. However, when we see specific projects and specific initiatives, we can oftentimes see that level of support decrease and see a degree of opposition. And I think that really points to a curiosity of what's leading to that local opposition and those challenges. And I think a need for us to really zero in on what works well to help stakeholders have a seat at the table, how to help them feel like they can effectively engage in the process to sort of deal with the power imbalance that may feel very real with the resources brought to the table from an offshore wind developer versus what a small community might have at its disposal. So yeah, I think we oftentimes say the outcome is only as good as the process that led to it. And I think that's what we see in terms of the ability to get these projects up off the ground is, can we have a win-win, and can we use really productive engagement strategies to help overcome some of the challenges?
Thank you, Susanna. That was great, and I'm sure some folks will have some opinions about that too once we sort of open the floor with Jen in just a little bit. Before we do that, I want to be able to bring in some of the panelists that Jen introduced earlier, Richard and Andre and Kim, who've agreed to give us some insights. And I know you all have been dealing with this issue of community benefits in your own way. You know, one of the things that my student Grant found when he talked to people in Kitty Hawk, people who were very much like you, sort of key stakeholders in a community, is he found that different people really did define what their community was differently. For many people, they looked beyond sort of initial municipal boundaries to understand sort of an area or a collection of municipalities that they considered to be their community. But I know that's different in different locations. Kim or Andre or Richard, do you want to tackle this question and how people back home for you are thinking about this definition of community? I know in some places it may be very defined by the land mass that you have.
Right. Thank you, David. Hello, Richard Andre with Vineyard Power Cooperative. On the island of Martha's Vineyard, which just for a little bit of background, we have about 18,000 year-round residents, ranging from, you know, the typical rural demographics, I would say, you know, various income levels, but, you know, primarily made up of teachers, police officers, healthcare workers, builders, and the trades. And then every July and August for about 8 to 10 weeks, we go from a sleepy 18,000 resident community to about 100,000 people. So it's quite a change. A good part of urban America, and in fact, maybe parts of the world come to our shores to enjoy the beauty of the island. I think, in fact, the year-round residents probably go down about 10,000 in January and February when some snowbirds take off. So that's our community. You know, David, you're on into a very good point. We're an island, but we have 6 municipalities. And for people that are familiar with our community, those 6 municipalities, you know, have different personalities. You know, they each have their own budget, their own elected officials, their own police force. And it's hard to think in a very small island that we would have that type of diversity. And there's even some jokes if, you know, Edgartown, which is where our county seat is, says yes, you know, almost by definition. Oak Bluffs, which is a very big resort town, says no. But that being said, our community is pretty easy to define because we're an island. And, you know, we have, you know, it's a fixed geographical border. You know, we know we're on the island and we look across the water and that's the mainland, or we call, you know, the USA sometimes, mainland USA. So, you know, that definition changes, right? Locally, there's a little bit of that competition, but then, you know, we can really define our community. And there is a really good, you know, pretty big sense of community pride there. So that's just a little bit of a background on us. We were formed in 2008. So I've been involved in offshore wind for what is it now, 13, 14 years. It's unbelievable that we still only have that Block Island 5 turbine project off of Rhode Island that was mentioned earlier. It's kind of what I've been working on. It's been defined as a career project, you know, trying to get commercial scale offshore wind off the ground. But we were motivated by something I think has been said earlier, maybe I think it was Suzanne, that when you asked our island back in 2008, how many people were in favor of offshore wind, renewable energy, we had overwhelming support in those surveys, you know, 80+%. It's just then when you get to specific projects, as Suzanne said, that 80% support almost flips in some cases. And we had a pretty good experience with Cape Wind. It was the failed offshore wind farm that never got built. off the shores here, you know, the opposition was above 60%. So, you know, there's that big disconnect. And, you know, I think it's been described to me as when you hear the sentences, I'm in favor of renewable energy, but everything that matters is after the but, right? It's, you know, and so it did make us ask a lot of questions here about why that is. And Suzanne highlighted that. And some of it really boiled down to the disconnect between the risk and the reward. And I think David mentioned that earlier, you know, down in Kitty Hawk. You know, the risks, meaning the change, the impact in these coastal communities. That's what I mean by risk, but the perception and sometimes the real facts on the ground is the reward, the benefits, the economic development and benefits goes elsewhere. And sometimes those benefits are not just economic development. Those benefits can be also described as maybe a voice in the permitting process. You know, just simple things like having a say in how projects are developed. So that's what we looked around, and we looked around the world, and we looked, first of all, up in Maine, where Suzanne mentioned a lot of islands and coastal communities, but then through Suzanne's group, they also looked at island communities around the world, you know, Hawaii, Alaska, in our own country, but, you know, across Europe and Asia. We actually focused on an island in Denmark called Samso Island, and we looked at their model, and that's how we ended up with a cooperative model. So our Vineyard Power Co-op, we're a cooperative made up of residents, and we have about 3,500 members of our cooperative, and we cross municipal bounds, right? Because that's the difficulty. One island, 6 municipalities, you had almost 6 voices speaking, but we kind of formed a uniform cooperative of residents, and then we began to speak on behalf of this defined community and trying to define our benefits. But I'll leave it at that for the moment.
Thank you, Richard. And I apologize. First of all, in my notes, I turned you into 2 people.
It happens regularly with my name, so that's no problem.
Thank you. The person I missed when I get a list of people on the panel is Tara Heyer from up in Maine. Tara, do you want to add into some of the conversations that you've had at Monhegan about benefits there?
So around this idea of describing community that we were speaking about, it is kind of interesting. So I live on Monhegan Island. I'm here right now, and we have a year-round population of between 45 and 65 people. And then in the summer season, it's around 500 people. And most of those people aren't here continuously through the whole season. So it'll be different 500 people cycling through. And so when it came to defining community, it was a bit of a challenge because yes, it's our 45 to 65 year-round residents, but it's also this larger community who loves Monhegan, who comes here every year, and they're very invested in their experience when they're on Monhegan. So we needed to find that balance of respecting those people and yet keeping an eye on the year-round residents. And also, you know, we are defined as Monhegan as our community, but we're a part of Maine, and our neighbors, of our onshore neighbors, they had very different wants and needs and concerns than we did. There's the fishing community within our island, so they're its own little community within our island, but it's also the bigger community of Maine and the fisheries of Maine. For me personally, it was interesting, my thought process, because I'm, yes, concerned about my island and my very small community, but I'm also thinking about the state of Maine and how can this be beneficial, and trying to weigh, that's part of the balancing act. Is this going to be great, better for the state of Maine? Is it going to be better for the globe in general, the earth, you know? So those are all that's all community, you know, like trying to define yourself within that community and finding that balance within that community. So of course, with our community benefits agreement, we narrowed in on our geographic location of Monhegan Island when we were negotiating that. But I do see this sense of community and how it can be flexible, and it can complicate the situation.
I think you make that's a great reflection about how communities can sometimes be embedded, right? You have a larger community, and within that, there are smaller communities that form different coalitions and practices. And Kim, does that ring true with your experience as well at Block Island?
Absolutely. In fact, you know, what Tara said, as well as Richard, it seems like it's all a matter of scale. Block Island, which is where I am today, has a year-round population of 1,000, and it can go up to 18 to 20,000 on any given summer day. Some of those are visitors for the day, but many of those are summer homeowners, and it's the same sort of setup, only a bigger scale as on Monhegan, in that the summer homeowners have a completely different, not completely, but a very different motivation and view of the Block Island community. For them, it's a place of respite and a paradise that they go to get away from the workaday world. And for those of us on Block Island, it is our workaday world. So we have, you know, we're motivated in maybe slightly different ways. And that's really where opposition and came from on Block Island, was between those two views of what Block Island was. Is it a paradise that should not be besmirched with a view issue, an aesthetic issue, or is it a working community that has you know, gigantic power, cost issues, and maybe a very idealistic community that's very concerned about climate change and the greater good. And so there's a lot of tension around that at some points. So I definitely see that in the neighborhood discussion, the different groups. But we are on Block Island, it's the Block Island Wind Farm, but we always have to remember that it was a project initiated between the state of Rhode Island and the developer. And we were just the place that this was going to play out on. And so we have ended up with, I think, a whole suite, many of the types of community benefits that you spoke about, some direct, some indirect. But because we are the place where it happened, you know, we are 3 miles away from this, not, you know, 20 miles away to the mainland coast of Rhode Island, which, by the way, we call America, as opposed to United States, right? So we all have our similar lingo of how we separate ourselves from each other. So anyway, I think that it's many of the same issues in Monhegan and Martha's Vineyard, and just a matter of scale. And I look forward to
Kim,
talking more about the details. So.
Yes.
Well, while you and Richard and Tara were talking, I saw a lot of nodding heads among our other panelists, from Claire and from David and from Suzanne. I'm wondering if they have some points that they'd like to make around their experience, or even some questions they might want to ask you, or some wisdom to share as well.
I can dive in first with something brief, just to follow up on what Kimberly's just said. Your summary then, Kimberly, was absolutely fascinating, and what you described about the two different competing visions of Block Island, between this paradise that should be unspoilt and between a working community, that's sort of a microcosm of so many debates and controversies over wind energy around the world, because the places where it tends to be windiest tend to be the remote, beautiful, most valuable landscapes and seascapes. So that was absolutely fascinating to hear that that's been very much the experience for your particular island. So thank you very much for sharing that.
And Claire, it's the same, the three islands, the difference being the size of the communities, but they all have that same dynamic. And we, as the year-rounders, we call ourselves, versus the seasonal, we're all neighbors. You know, and I'm sure that that's the same in those other communities. And those people that come here seasonally, that want the respite, that they also want to feel part of the community as well. So you have to kind of try to play off that aspect of it. for them to kind of own that the place that they come to get respite has working people that are there to help make their experience better. And, so that's a really big part of the kind of education, to make sure you treat your seasonal residents as neighbors as well.
David, did you have something you wanted to add?
Yes, I can also add to what Kimberly and what Claire said. From my experience, it's really the same, that we see the different understandings of maybe residents who've been living in a coastal area for a long time and spent their whole life there, and then also that summer house owners or people who are there for a certain season might be a bit more skeptical about like planned offshore wind farm project, especially near offshore wind farm projects that we saw in Denmark, but also off the Scottish coast and as well. So, and that's why it's really important to get both groups on board there and also consider both of their concerns really, and maybe also reflect that in the setup of and the design of some benefit schemes there and as well. So this is really a common thing that we see.
And I'll just add one other thing that goes back to what Suzanne was saying, and that was about communication. And what we talking about in a lot was the communication between the sort of the island representatives and the developer, but the communication between all the different stakeholders within the island itself becomes really, really critical. I say we don't have completely different visions of what Block Island is. We just have them where they diverge at certain points, because at home, I would say everybody that has a second home here, as well as everybody who lives here, has the same love and passion for the beauty and some of the isolation of the place. And then it diverges a little from there. So maintaining that communication so that, it's really hard. It's, it's one of the biggest, I would say, obstacles. And then add on to that, negotiating with the big state or the big developer just adds right on top of that. So,
yeah, Suzanne, you had something you wanted to add?
Yeah, I was just going to laugh. I feel like the state and the developers got to say that they are negotiating with the big Kim Gaffett. So, I don't underestimate yourself there and what you've done. From the Island Institute's perspective, a lot of what we try to do is to support islanders like Tara, Richard, and Kim to grapple with really complex issues and to try to think what are some helpful resources to help them, and what, in this instance, somebody's coming, showing an interest in the waters around their island. It wasn't really something they initiated necessarily. And although Richard, I think y'all were a little more proactive. And so one of the things that we've done to try to be helpful is just to connect these islands to each other to see how they can kind of learn, because a lot of this is happening in real time, different parts of the process. These three communities and in Nantucket are going through similar issues. And so I guess I have a question for each of you. And Kim, you were saying kind of wanting to get into the nuts and bolts of how this worked. Can each of you think of anything that you could share that you feel like you learned from one of the other island communities in New England that really either really resonated with you or that actually kind of changed the way that your community went about this process?
Maybe I'll take that first. Well, Suzanne, obviously, through your organization, we got to meet Kim. When we took the field trip to Block Island, we got to meet the island communities and so forth. So that was always helpful, having that network. But in our case, we really learned from Cape Wind, because, who didn't know about that project? I'm sure most of us knew about it. It was the almost the 12, 13-year failed project, right? And it consumed our community at whole. Literally, the project was proposed about 3 to 4 miles offshore, which is this little pocket of federal water, because federal water starts at 3 miles. Kim will speak about Block Island. That project is within state waters. That's within the 3-mile limit. So we were just outside that. So that's where we were. That was our learning curve right there. And as I said earlier, it was about this disconnect, risk and reward. On that disconnect, I do want to mention something a little bit about, when you're negotiating with, let's say, the state in Kim's part, but well, I should say this. When you speak about offshore wind, it's always federal and state, even, well, in our case, if it's in federal water, but you always have to deal with the state, right? The power purchase agreements are with the state. They control the utilities through usually their Public Utilities Commission. And how policy makers go about the development of this resource does matter in the sense of, if you look at New York, Massachusetts, there was a lot of emphasis placed on economic development rather than just price of electricity, right? There's a trade-off there. A developer can really come in and offer the lowest price because they offer no economic development. The development of ports, the development of whatever these community benefits as you described, Matt, so at a policy level, that's a kind of important thing to get, because typically developers, they'll kind of go to the least common denominator if they feel the project can get permitted. So there is a policy question there of influencing the policymakers. So whether it was Kim and Tara, there's a lot of time spent at the State House, right, or through your state reps. So you've got to have that constituency too. But in our case, forming a cooperative with 3,500 members, when you do then speak to a developer, you said, Suzanne, you complimented Kim. They listen. It's unifying as a community does help. Right, having that kind of first of all, defining the community, but then organizing around what that entity is. What is that community benefit organization? Forget about community benefit agreement. You need what's the entity that's negotiating. And one of the things that we took right away was we didn't really want to negotiate money. And I know Suzanne has came up in the Engaging Communities in Offshore Wind paper that I think David mentioned earlier, that was back in 2015. Everything is money, but it's a little different than just asking for money from a developer, right? That has two pitfalls. One, it appears within the community that you're being, you've sold out to the developer, or the developer from their side thinking, they're paying a bribe or some kind of way. So defining community benefits is really a critical issue, right? Everything's money, but if you define it as, we want workforce development, we want coastal port infrastructure, we want jobs, right? Or we want to help to be 100% renewable community. So I think there's that subtlety of, what you define around the community benefit is kind of a critical one.
Thank you, Richard. I want to give Tara a chance to chime in too on Suzanne's question, or maybe even following up on some of the things that Richard was mentioning.
Thank you, David. Yeah, so we lagged, our project lagged a bit behind both Richard's and Kim. So we did have that benefit of seeing some things that happened already and kind of learning from their experience, which was really helpful. And Suzanne put me in touch with Richard kind of early on in the process. And it was just interesting to have this perspective of, oh, they're kind of taking the lead in this in a lot of ways. Like they're getting the community on board and they prior to an actual project going forward. And we were in the position of being like a little behind, like, oh, we need to figure this out now because there's going to be a project. Which is more what Kim had as an experience. And so it was really helpful to see how both of those communities handled it. And like Kim's community designated or identified a person within their community that would be really good at just talking to the regular person, to be a part of the project and working with the developer on a regular basis, and then kind of being someone that other people feel comfortable going to with their questions. So I thought that was really smart. So that was not something necessarily that we've implemented, but it's something that if and as this project goes forward, we may be able to try and do something like that. So yeah, these opportunities to hear from other people and what their experience has been invaluable.
Yeah, hey, Kim, do you want to answer Suzanne's question? It may have been different for you all being so early in the game.
Yeah.
And then after Kim, I'll turn it over to Jen.
Okay. Just sort of follow up on both Tara and Richard. it was early for us, that's true, but I would say that the whole Block Island experience, whether you're talking about it from Block Island's point of view or the developer, which was Deepwater Wind, they learned from the Cape Wind project too, because they saw a failure and said, okay, what went wrong there? And what really happened is Deepwater Wind recognized that they should have a liaison to Block Island that was a trusted person. And it actually took them, it was not their first person that they chose. It was a second person who was a community member and well-respected, interested in the area, who was hired by Deepwater Wind to be their Block Island liaison. And he did all the organization of setting up meetings and bringing information, and it made it, from my point of view, which as the first warden, which is an odd term. So for those of you who don't know, it's the head of the town council. So I have the ability to talk directly with Brian Wilson, their liaison, and we already had an established knowledge of each other. And then we could go and, talk to our various people, if you will. I think that, I'm speaking for them and shouldn't be, but I would say that experience of having the liaison be the go-between that was so well suited to the Block Island experience was the result of watching what happened at Cape Wind and what didn't happen at Cape Wind. So it goes back to the communication piece as well. So.
Great, thank you. Thank you. So we can continue those lessons learned. That's a great question, Suzanne. I just wanted to now reach out to the audience, however, just to see if anyone has any questions. And again, you're welcome to write your comments in the chat room, or you can either raise your hand like physically, or use one of those little emojis. Amelia Moore is here. Amelia, can you unmute yourself? I know you have a question.
Hi, thanks for everything today. So interesting so far, and I really enjoy the conversation. My camera also doesn't work, so you get to look at my dog. Sorry about that. My question is about environmental justice issues, and I know this might not apply in the same way everywhere, especially to those of us who are in the conversation who are not American. But in the U.S. context, this has been legally defined as issues that affect minoritized communities defined by race, class, and non-English speaking language, and combinations of those. And I'm just wondering, have environmental justice issues come up in any of the cases that we're talking about here today?
Amelia, if I can have a go at that, initially anyway. In the 6 communities on Martha's Vineyard, I meant the 6 municipalities, this kind of micro community within the island community. 2 of them are defined legally as environmentally justice communities. So they're part of our mix. We, in our community benefit agreement with Vineyard Wind, we wanted to address that. And the way that we approached it was through the establishment of a resiliency fund. That's money, economic development money that's going to be used to help make our energy system more resilient. But it's not just resilient, it's also access to low-income ratepayers, or through let's say kind of a form of addressing environmental injustice. And so that's about bringing renewable energy to the demographics that have been left out of it, right? Because what you find a lot, especially in our community, is people that have solar panels on their roofs, and they're committed to that. They're the people that can afford it. So in our benefit, we have specific funds to develop community-based projects, community solar, and basically allocate a lot of the output of that to those environmental justice communities.
Thank you, Richard. Does Tara or Kim, do you have any thoughts on that question? I am going to pass it over to Claire as well, because you talk about energy justice in your presentation. But before that, Kim or Tara, do you have any thoughts?
I'll just quickly say that I wish we'd done what Richard just described. So part of the lessons learned on Block Island, unfortunately, are probably going to be after the fact, but I think there's still options there, and Block Island certainly has had a lot of benefits, but I wish we had thought to do something more along the lines of support for the cost of power for those, people who would meet a certain criteria or whatever. But secondarily, I know one of the community benefits on the island was a lump sum that went to the our historic lighthouse and the Block Island Historical Society. And if I understand correctly, some of that those monies were tied to the fact that where the siting of the lighthouse looks out on ancestral Native Indigenous peoples' lands. And so part of the negotiation with the Indigenous tribes of Rhode Island and their historical perspective before sea level covered it all over all their lands was taken into consideration in that discussion. Now, I wasn't directly involved in that, so my facts on that are a little loose, but that is my understanding.
Thank you. Tara?
So when we were doing our community benefits agreement, we did a lot of discussions within our community, obviously, and surveys and things. And one of the things we did was come up with core value areas, and environment was one of those things. And so that helped us to focus and define our negotiations around improving the environment as part of that, and like having sustainable renewable energy, and we built that into our community benefits package. So yeah, definitely was something that we were thinking about.
Great. Claire, can you talk a little bit about your perspective? Again, this is nicely presented in your recording, and then I'll ask Suzanne as well.
Sure, thanks very much, Jen. And this is a great question, Amelia, thank you. In the UK, we don't have the same legal definition of environmental justice, but these issues speak more broadly to a concept of energy justice. And that's absolutely about trying to balance the costs and benefits of energy generation throughout the whole spectrum, from where component parts are sourced all the way through to where particular developments are based and those communities around them. And some of the specificities of the community benefit schemes around the UK and across Europe have been about trying to target particular communities who suffer perhaps from higher levels of deprivation, for example, or some of the elements of those community benefit schemes are focused on to particular groups who are sometimes more marginalised or sometimes lack opportunities. So, for example, through trying to fund community facilities in places where there aren't any, or funding apprenticeships in areas of high unemployment. But this tends to be an ad hoc sort of arrangement. And again, it tends to depend on particular communities, what particular communities might need, what they might argue that they need, rather than anything that's more institutionalized.
Thank you, Claire. Suzanne, again, the Island Institute has some amazing resources. We've put a link. I'm going to add a link to the Island Institute's library, which is amazing, below. But go ahead, why don't you answer that question too, Suzanne?
Thanks, Jen. Yeah, there's a neat little video of when we all went to visit Kim a few years ago. That might be fun to watch after this. Just a couple of things to add. While I don't think we've really explicitly used the EJ frame in a lot of this work, I'd put out a couple of related pieces. I think energy burden is a factor that is really significant on many islands, especially within the year-round populations. Folks may not be aware, but Kim and Tara's communities in particular are paying or were paying very high electricity rates, multiple times the national average for diesel generated power. Heating fuels to the islands are generally at a premium as well over what folks pay on the mainland. So when you combine that with the income levels that can be relatively modest or on the lower end within the year-round population with those higher costs of energy, we see pretty high degrees of energy burden in these communities. And so the fact that both Monhegan and Block Island have had goals and through Vineyard Power's work to really lower the cost of energy is one of the ways that I think we're trying to address that particular issue through the benefits agreements and engagement in these projects. The other thing I would just add that through our lens of working with small island communities, it's a really interesting way to kind of take a closer look at the barriers to participation and sort of the power dynamics at play in developments like this. I think it's safe to say that in all instances here in New England, there were real challenges in terms of the local capacity and available resources to really just have a seat at the table and actively follow and engage in these processes, just because the limited number of people and people wearing many different hats is this phenomenon we talk about in small rural communities. So while it may not necessarily connect directly to race, class, or language barriers, I think just this idea of who can be a part of the decision-making process, who can have access to information, whose voices can be heard, I think has given us a lot to think about that does translate and relate to the environmental justice discussions.
Great, thank you, Suzanne. And I'm just going to ask Judy Gray, who is a Block Island resident, to provide some insight. And then I'm going to call on John Barlow, who also has some thoughts on this topic as well. We'll change the topic a bit. Go ahead, Judy.
Well, so I actually, since this is my one big chance to have some input, I had a couple of things. One is that Kimberly Gafford mentioned the Block Island wind farm manager that was on the island. He, together with, I think, URI's extension and others, the Sea Grant program in Rhode Island, did a ton of surveys. So when they were going through the development process, I was one of those dreaded summer people. I live here year round now, but at the time I was a dreaded summer person. And what they did in sending out surveys and holding town hall meetings, I would come and go through the winter to get my home prepared for the summer. I attended many meetings and did a bunch of surveys. That made a huge difference. And a lot of the surveys showed like photographs of what it would look like from the bluffs, what it would look like, from town. And, the picture behind Jen could have been one of the pictures that was in the report. So I thought that was really helpful as a part-time resident at the time, how it made me feel connected to the project. Talked about how much diesel they wouldn't burn, things like that mattered to me. On the issue of environmental justice, I did raise, and I think I got an answer in the chat, the fact that while I felt like we did a great job including the indigenous peoples of Rhode Island in the process, which was at the beginning, I'm sure, kind of hard to figure out, but now we have this, great relationship and conduit that we can use for other projects. A wonderful continue to develop. Of other underserved communities, there was a big kerfuffle during the project development around where the cable was going to land. And I understand now that it's gone in at Scarborough Beach in Narragansett, but man, Narragansett did throw up a fluff, and that's a very wealthy community. And, you just got to wonder, do underserved communities that maybe don't have as many wealthy lawyers living right along their shorelines, how do we make sure that they have a voice that can compete with, some of the richer communities? It's certainly around Narragansett Bay, it's an interest.
Thank you, Judy.
Thank you.
So we're gonna hear from John Barlow. John,
yes,
for you. Could you briefly say a little bit about what's going on with you? So thank you.
Oh, geez. Well, you saw I tried to keep that's as brief as I could do it in the text with regards to the amount of problems the island communities have had here. Our island grids on the 5 of the 8 islands that actually have grids are monopolized So the cost of electricity here on my island, say, is 36 cents per kilowatt. And on Oahu, where most of the wind farms, number of wind farms are, is 32. They also have a geothermal, well, the geothermal's not back online, but because of the other outer island groups, Maui, the Big Island here, well, Lanai is kind of a black sheep. The connections or distributions of the power grid cannot be accomplished because of the resistance or the loss of energy it takes to run the lines between islands. So only each island gets to use what they have as far as wind farms. And the problem with wind farms, as I see it, and what they've been an issue, is that they're limited to 3 to 5 megawatt generators, up on that pedestal. And they're ugly. I mean, basically, as modern as they are, they're not like the old Western multi-vane thing. But these wind vanes, because of their overall length and speeds they acquire at their wingtips, we've had a number of our wildlife, the birds particularly, wiped out, or flying animals. I mean, we do have bats, like I mentioned, but they get knocked out of the sky or pulverized because of the speed. They can't make up for the speed of the blades coming through. And we're not a problem, or we don't have a problem with ice buildup. As I've mentioned before in talking, that ice, knowledge of ice comes from when I was in Alaska, and they did a study on doing wind generators there, and found that the condensation, because of the speed and everything, normal physics, ice condenses on buildup on the vanes or the blades, and once they reach a maximum density, they get flung off, and they actually become meteorites that are tossed hundreds of miles away. And where, of course, it wasn't too bad for where the study was taken, because there were no homes or villages. But I'm just thinking, because of the density of the Northeast populace, and where whichever way the directions of these windmills are, I'm sure during the winter time there's going to be some problems with ice being cast off. And being an island state, we don't have the luxury of being able to put offshore windmills on, because of the fact that our waters are too deep, for one thing, and that there's submarines, fishing boats, and everything else that really don't want to see these things out there. Although it's not bad, they're anchored, and you have a lot of fish congregate on the mooring, but otherwise they become a nuisance. And wave generators too. It's some of the it looks like you guys are pretty well set on doing offshore wind, and there has been other issues, like I think it was in Great Britain to do, or in UK to do wind generator type, or wave generator, excuse me. But then now you have logs or floating objects,
Thank you. Thank you, John. And it's great to have you here and to provide your perspective on that. Is there any, Claire or David, are there any thoughts on what John is saying, or any perspective you'd like to bring up? Okay. All right.
I was trying to catch David's eye through the ether then, but I'm happy to go first. That's fine.
I'm
really interested to hear about what you were saying, John. I mean, it's very disappointed to hear a lot of what you were saying. Perhaps I'll just pick up on the issue about birds. Good sighting is clearly critical. And in the UK, for example, there's legislation and extensive environmental impact assessments that have to be done to try and ensure that good sighting. There's a charitable organisation in the UK called the RSPB, which is the Royal Society for the Protection of Birds. And we are a nation of animal lovers here. This is one of the biggest charities in the UK. We're very keen on small fluffy birds. And the position that the RSPB have taken is that they support offshore wind farms, provided, key criteria, provided they're well sited, because the risks of climate change are more of a threat to birds. So that's the position that they've taken. But the key thing is that these turbines have to be in the right place. And that there has to be the appropriate work done to try and get them into the right place if we're going to move forward. So I'm really sorry to hear about what's been happening and some of your experience there. And I saw your comment in the chat as well about developers lining their pockets. And I'm sure David Rudolph and I, we can both talk about examples of bad development and bad developers. And community benefits can be a really good thing for communities, for reinvigorating, revitalizing communities. Community benefits can be fantastic, but they don't make a bad project good. A project has to be a good project in the first place. It has to be appropriately cited. There has to be the appropriate due diligence done to make sure that there aren't these very significant, as you are describing, environmental impacts. So community benefits make a good project even better.
So David, I'm not gonna call on you. I am gonna move this conversation forward, sorry. We have a question for Richard, and I would, if any of the other panelists want to chime in on this. Richard, to what extent has been possible to transfer your experiences from Denmark? You mentioned that you were looking at Denmark, and I know you guys have sort of a community of practice amongst the islands. The question is what transfer of experience did you have from listening and understanding the Denmark experience?
Thank you, Jennifer, for noting that question. The all roads lead to Rome, but in offshore wind, all roads lead to Denmark is not an understatement. They were really the country that kind of pioneered the industry, although a lot of their development and most of the development was done in the UK waters, as well as Denmark. But so the lessons that we learned, and just to point out that Vineyard Wind, who we do have a community benefit agreement with, and we've been working with since 2010, is 50% owned by Danish, investors and technical experts. So we still have that connection through the developer that we're with. I think that was kind of helpful, having the kind of Danish DNA within Vineyard Wind. There was a lot of experience that they brought to the equation. I think what Claire is saying is, they're good developers. They had 20 years of experience. They probably made mistakes on their way, and they learned from their successes. So that they brought that willingness to engage. I believe in their approach was engaging with the community early on increases the risk of developing a good project and increases the probability that it would be implemented. So you have to have that kind of foundational knowledge. But specifically for us, when we looked over and kind of honed in on Samsø Island in Denmark, first of all, it was an island. We're an island. There's obviously that obvious comparison, but more importantly, it was their cooperative model, right? It's the model of corporate ownership, cooperative ownership, community ownership. And that's where that was the real key takeaway for us. So we formed a cooperative, and I mentioned we have about 3,500 members. Those members vote on key decisions that the cooperative was making, whether it was agreements with offshore wind developers, whether it was about siting the turbines. Claire just mentioned, siting is critical. And those members vote on not only key decisions, but they vote on the leadership of the cooperative. They vote on the board of directors. So it's a really small d democratic structure. It's different than a municipal structure, obviously. And it was one of our, we wanted to be different. One, we had to be, I mentioned earlier, we had 6 municipalities. It wasn't just the one, but it was a deliberate lesson from Denmark to form the cooperative and have that small d democratic process. And it's worked for us. And and what is a cooperative? It's not only democratically controlled organization, but the benefits are then shared amongst the members, right? Shared amongst the community. So that was our biggest takeaway, was right at the inception of choosing what model we were going to take in this, and it was the cooperative one.
Thank you. David, you being from Denmark, and I'm assuming Suzanne, you were part of that too. Do you guys have anything to add to what Richard said?
Yeah, I would just echo, we've really enjoyed learning from Samsu Island, looking into some of the other cooperatively owned or sort of benefit schemes there. I know, I think it's Middelgrunden in Copenhagen Harbor, that model. We've looked to that for quite a bit. We had the chance to bring some Main Islanders to Samsu Island. We have brought Soren Hermansen from Samsu to Monhegan. I know there's been connections to the vineyard, and I think for us, one of the ways that we first connected with Richard was around the and I think maybe even Kim as well, was around the development of a land-based island project, the Fox Islands Wind Project on Vinyl Haven Island, which is cooperatively owned by the electric cooperative on that island. So I think some of the earlier conversations were to say, how do we take the power and benefits around local community ownership of land-based wind and transfer some of that to projects in the ocean. So that is, I think, oftentimes within island communities, that cooperative, locally owned piece really resonates because folks are 12, 20 miles out to sea. You've got to rely on each other. And the idea of having some local control is the only control that you do have when you're out in the middle of the ocean by yourself. And so I just think any ways that we can leverage that sort of predisposition and sort of local cultural inclination is going to be a strong match for developments around island communities.
Great. David?
Yeah, no, just wanted to add, it's really exciting to hear that you've been engaging with Samsu and also hearing about Middelgrunden, because I think, I mean, I'm not from Denmark, but those projects actually have been kind of been seen as those kind of lighthouse projects. And I also know that those projects are really interested in reaching out to other communities and help them doing things in their local context as well. And with regard to Middelgrunden, I'm not sure whether I'm saying too much here, but I think they are also discussing at the moment to repower this offshore wind farm, which is in community hands or partially owned by the Copenhagen utility, but also cooperatively owned. So this is also an exciting project that's going on at the moment to see how this will turn out.
Great, thank you. I know that Dave Monty has had his hand up, and so Dave knows, please unmute and let's hear your question.
Great. My name is Dave Monty. I'm a charter captain from Rhode Island and very active in the recreational community in regard to offshore wind. And
Captain Dave, it's hard to hear you. Can you,
Sure.
maybe get a little closer?
Sure. Can folks hear me now? Okay.
Much better,
great.
thank you.
Okay. I think it was the earbuds that were doing it, and my dog barking didn't help much either. But I'm active in the fishing community. I know the fishing community from the recreational perspective is concerned about cable landings. I see and saw how the community on Long Island responded to the South Fork wind farm cable landing. And that developer, what they had to go through with the various counties on Long Island. But we have a situation up and down the coast, and we have one right here in Rhode Island where cables will be coming up our bay perhaps, or up our rivers, and they will actually engage several major communities. So rather than thousands, it may impact hundreds of thousands of people in more urban settings. So how does a developer or developers handle that issue where they're going through 4 or 5 communities? Do they deal with each community? Do an overarching organizations, have they formed? So I'd be very curious in Europe, where cables have landed in multiple cities, multiple communities, uprivers, up bays, how that issue was addressed to facilitate the development of offshore wind.
Yeah, and I think there's one point that I would like to add or answer to that. But it's really like with the increasing number of offshore wind farms, especially around the UK, the issue of landing the cable, and the issue of the cable route has become really important, and actually people are starting to realize that now, and that this needs to be kind of organized and coordinated in a different way and as well. So as I said in my presentation, there was actually just one example of a consented offshore wind farm which got a little bit of holdback because of the cable route and the substation there. Because of,
so are we saying we don't have a lot of experience doing that yet, and that some kind of organization, or it needs a different approach because it's not one small community, it needs a different approach?
Yeah, well, David, if I might add, in my experiences with some of the Danish folks I had been working with, a generalization would be some of the permitting in Europe, the lessons learned were, it was kind of a top-down approach. And that is exactly the opposite in the United States. It's a real bottom-up permitting approach. And you asked the question, and I think you answered your own question, which is, you need to go to every single community that cable is crossing through, and big or small, and engage early with those communities, because they all bottom up have a say in it. Now, they might not be the ultimate deciding body, because that might be controlled in Massachusetts through electrical facility siting boards, a permitting agency outside of the municipalities, because, David, way back when, no community wanted power cables or power plants, right? So there's a kind of a statewide permitting agency, but they listen very, very closely to what the local communities are saying. So, bottom up, Dave, you need to touch all of them. And therefore, what you're seeing in a lot of the developers is a very big organization around outreach, community outreach and permitting, and getting in early and knocking on the doors and holding. Kimberly mentioned it earlier, whether it's a small island community, but having those meetings, libraries, town halls, So David, it is really, you have to touch as many faces as you can.
I'd like to chime in just for a moment on that subject too, is that the developer, it would be nice if the developer did that in a comprehensive way, in the sense that we ended up feeling like pitted against other communities. And then like that community doesn't want the landing in that community. They're very upset. And then they're angry with us because we're engaging with the developer. And it's like puts us in really awkward situations and positions that could have been avoided. So if we're going to be sharing these lessons with developers, that's one that could definitely be learned.
Claire, do you have something to add here?
Thanks, Jen. Just very briefly, this is something that's become very apparent in Scotland, and we now tend to think of an offshore wind farm as having multiple epicentres of impact. So that might well be the turbines offshore, it might well be where the cabling comes onshore, and then it might be a substation or communities who are along that cable. So thinking absolutely not just about what's happening in the sea, but about these multiple epicentres and the impacts that might be experienced at all of them. And therefore, as Richard has said, consulting with all of them and thinking about benefits for all of them.
Great. Okay, so I know we're getting to a close, but I'd like to hear a bit from Drew. And Drew, maybe we're getting to our point of words of wisdom and thoughts. So maybe just a brief sort of thought process on what you're thinking, with the understanding that no one is going to respond to your question.
I'll try to be very brief. I think this is extremely interesting, really from the perspective of where we've been. A very small scale, largely focused on quite small communities, quite small projects. We've learned a lot from that. But as we look at the move to go to scale, Scotland is a really great example. They've rotated their offshore oil supply infrastructure to provide offshore wind support infrastructure. We do not have that in the Northeast. So we are frantically working on the supply chain side So the consequences of offshore development will be much more profound in the ports, in displacement of commercial fishing, in changes in the nature of the supply chain, all the way up the Hudson River to Albany, across the entire region. So we really have to expand our perception of community. And in particular, the new executive orders addressing environmental justice and addressing racial equity in the context of climate change and the context of outreach are going to, at least in the short term, be a very big driver. And we haven't really prepared for that. The developers don't have a lot of experience with that. It's a very different context here. So I think, that we're going to have to really widen out this focus tremendously to engage with a huge range of communities. Every state is in competition for jobs, and they're beginning to work that out. But this will have knock-on effects for years and years and years.
Thank you, Drew. Okay, and on that theme of last words of wisdoms, hopes for the future, Tara, could you start us off with your thoughts?
I would say like the takeaway is engage early, engage often, engage all the time. Like that's the primary thing. You got to get in there and start talking to people. And I think our developers believed they were doing that, but it was pretty superficial. So like a very pointed engagement early, way before it's actually happening. So there's not the pressure of, oh, this is going to happen like next week, and now we got to decide all this stuff. And as communities, if you're in this position that you can kind of see it on the horizon, start thinking about it now, because there's no better time.
Well said. Claire, any words of wisdom from you, or thoughts, hopes?
Thanks very much, Jen. I was thinking that the title of this webinar was wholly appropriate, because it's about negotiating and partnerships. And I think those are my two things to sort of take forward, that it's absolutely about negotiating, it's about talking, it's about communication, it's everything that Tara has just said. It's about talking about who counts as the relevant community, what those impacts might be, what benefits might be most appropriate. And it's absolutely about thinking about communities and developers as being in partnership. It was mentioned earlier about the power imbalance, and we're thinking here not about the sort of a top-down imposition of a project on a community, but about developing a partnership. And there's a couple of very useful comments, one from John and from David C. in the chat, about how we try and encourage developers to see this as a partnership. And I think it certainly takes commitment from a developer to work with a community, hopefully with a recognition that this is the right thing to do. But if we have a developer who is perhaps more interested in the bottom line than in morals and rights and so on, then perhaps we need developers to try and recognize that this is the effective thing to do, that harnessing local knowledge and expertise, building that trust with communities is much more likely to lead to agreement over better solutions.
Excellent. Thank you, Claire. Kim, I'm going to pass it to you. What are your words of wisdom? And you're on mute.
I couldn't agree more with both Tara and Claire that the partnership piece is probably the most important in getting involved and engaging and asking for what you need. Block Island, I think, did get a lot of different community benefits from this, for something that wasn't a project that started out to be something we wanted. Having said that, and it's a tiny project from what we're going to be seeing going forward, but I do feel good about what happened here. And yeah, we could have done things better or more, but that it was a success, that there was as much communication as there was, that there was as much negotiation, which continued right on to this year when they had to come back and do more work. Not even the same company that started this. So I guess the bottom line is really communicate, communicate, communicate. And ask for what you need, because we were tiny and we asked for monies that would help us get the expertise that we could never have afforded. And it was that particular part helped us a lot in the early part, and it was not the developer was not the gatekeeper. We got to get the funds, but we totally had control over who we hired, who could match the expertise with the company. And I think that was one of our first, that was one of the very first community benefits that happened. And it wouldn't have happened if we hadn't negotiated for it. And it wouldn't have happened if we didn't have such a great communication setup already with Deepwater Wind. I think those two things made that possible, and that probably set the stage for ongoing work. Now, as the first,
Thank you,
always
Kim.
look,
Kim, we're kind of
hindsight is 2020.
okay. Great, thank you. Sorry, we're losing people here. Suzanne.
I would just say offshore wind is coming. It's not going away. We're really far behind Europe, but this is a train that has left the station, and that doesn't mean that there aren't concerns. And as we heard from Claire, examples of when things aren't done as well, but we really need to start investing collectively in ways to make this work and address that power imbalance in the ways that Block Island and Manhegan and Martha's Vineyard have, to find constructive and productive ways through this, to ask for what you need. I wholeheartedly agree with, and find creative ways to support communities to go through this process. I think the developers absolutely, I think, carry an obligation to do this right and to do this well, but I think there are others, whether it's the states, bridging organizations, nonprofits, universities. I think there are all ways that we can step up to help make this process lead to better outcomes. And I really want to thank and acknowledge the leadership of Tara and Kim and Richard, because they have found ways to productively engage in this. It's allowing projects to move forward, and it's allowing us to find ways to address when things aren't working and to maximize that benefit. So I think they really deserve huge kudos for helping to shape the future of this industry in our region and in our country.
Thank you, Suzanne. Well said. David.
Yes, so my brief word of wisdom is pretty much in line with what Tara and also Claire said. It's really about talking to each other and engaging early, engaging very, very early, as soon as possible. Not just in order to see what the communities might be able to gain from a project, but also what the communities are able to bring to the table, and as well in order to identify the widest benefit possible and most sustainable benefit possible, and as well.
Thank you. Richard?
Thank you, Jennifer. Susan mentioned offshore wind's coming, it's not going away. In 2008, that's what we saw, not only with Cape Wind, but also the federal desire to release the Outer Continental Shelf. So our biggest takeaway was to be, have our reaction be proactive, right? We knew it was coming, so we were proactive in getting motivated to organize, engage, ask, as Kimberly says, for the benefits, be part of the process rather than reactive and being just a bystander. So act proactive and get out there and communicate. That's what we would say.
Great. Well, well said, all of you. Really amazing conversation, great interaction. Again, this is recorded. We will send the recording out to you all. Again, thank you, David Bidwell, for co-hosting this amazing show. And thank you all for your input, and let's keep the conversation going. All right, have a great rest of your day.